Elijah's heart raced as he stood frozen in the shadows of the alley. He watched as the man, gruff and menacing, dragged Sophie, a 6-year-old girl, by the arm toward a beat-up van parked just a few feet away. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but his grip on the girl's arm was ironclad. Sophie struggled, her small body fighting back with everything she had, but her efforts seemed futile against the man's strength. Elijah's pulse quickened, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to act. He didn't know who this girl was, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let her be taken. His feet finally moved, and without a second thought, Elijah rushed toward the van. He didn't have a plan, didn't have anything but his raw determination to stop this man. His breath came in quick gasps as he approached, ducking behind a dumpster to stay out of sight. He knew the man couldn't see him yet, but he had to act fast. Elijah waited for the right moment, his heart pounding in his chest. When the man reached the van and opened the sliding door, Elijah seized his chance. He dashed forward, surprising the kidnapper. "Hey!" Elijah shouted, his voice sharp and loud, a mix of fear and anger. The kidnapper spun around in surprise, but before he could react, Elijah grabbed a nearby brick from the ground and hurled it toward him. The brick hit the man's shoulder with a sickening thud, momentarily disorienting him. "Run!" Elijah screamed at Sophie, who was now standing frozen in shock. Sophie didn't hesitate. She sprinted away from the van, tears streaming down her face, as Elijah stood between her and the man. The kidnapper, enraged by the unexpected interruption, advanced toward Elijah. But just as he took a step forward, Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline, and before the man could react, Elijah swung at him with all his strength. The blow connected with the man's chest, sending him staggering back, temporarily winded. With the kidnapper momentarily off balance, Elijah grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her toward safety. He ran faster than he ever had, not looking back, not stopping until they reached the entrance of a nearby store. Sophie was gasping for breath, still crying, but she was safe. The store owner, an older woman, quickly saw what had happened and called the police. Elijah stood at the entrance, panting and covered in sweat, watching as the man, realizing he was beaten, fled the scene. But Elijah didn't let his guard down. He stayed with Sophie, holding her hand until the police arrived, making sure she was safe. The police arrived soon after, and Elijah gave a detailed account of what had happened. As the authorities went about their work, Sophie was soon reunited with her family, who had been frantically searching for her. When Sophie's parents arrived, their faces were full of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," her father said, his voice breaking. "You saved my daughter. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Elijah, feeling the weight of the moment, simply nodded. "I just did what was right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the van slow to a stop in front of an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the neighborhood. His instincts told him this was where the kidnapper had brought Sophie. Elijah wasn't going to let fear stop him now. He was already in too deep. The street was dark, and the van's headlights cast long shadows over the empty street as the door creaked open. The man exited the van, looking around before heading into the warehouse, leaving the door slightly ajar. Elijah carefully stepped out from behind the corner, staying out of the man's line of sight. He needed to be quiet and quick. He crouched low, his heart racing as he crept along the alley, keeping to the shadows. Elijah had lived on these streets long enough to know how to move unnoticed, how to slip between buildings and stay hidden. Reaching the edge of the warehouse, he paused and scanned the surroundings. The warehouse loomed before him, silent except for the occasional sound of the wind whistling through broken windows. Elijah could hear muffled voices coming from inside, one of them being the kidnapper's gruff tone. He pressed his ear to the side of the warehouse, straining to hear more. Inside, he could make out the sound of Sophie crying, soft but distinct. Elijah's heart clenched at the sound, but he didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, quietly, toward a side door. He found it slightly ajar and pushed it open slowly, making sure it didn't creak. He slipped inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, and Elijah's eyes adjusted to the darkness. He spotted Sophie immediately, her hands tied to a rusted pipe, her face streaked with tears. The kidnapper was a few feet away, talking loudly on his phone, seemingly distracted. Elijah's mind raced as he thought about what to do. His first instinct was to rush in, but he knew that would be too dangerous. He needed a distraction. Looking around, Elijah spotted a pile of old crates stacked in the corner. He grabbed a heavy piece of wood and tossed it toward the opposite side of the warehouse, making a loud crash. The kidnapper spun around, swearing under his breath. Elijah quickly rushed over to Sophie, who was sobbing but still awake. He whispered, "I'm here to help. I'm going to get you out of here." He fumbled with the rope tying her hands, but he couldn't untie it fast enough. "Hey!" the kidnapper yelled from across the room, realizing something was wrong. He lunged toward them, but Elijah was quicker. "Come on, Sophie, we've got to go." He pulled the last of the rope free and yanked her up, running toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, the kidnapper caught sight of them and let out a furious roar. "Get back here!" he yelled. Elijah's legs pumped faster, carrying Sophie through the door and out into the night. They dashed down the street, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the empty roads. The kidnapper was close behind, gaining ground. Elijah's breath was labored, but he didn't stop running. Sophie clung to his side, terrified but trusting him to get her to safety. "Help!" Elijah shouted, hoping someone would hear. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a group of people standing outside a late-night convenience store. One of the shopkeepers looked up, startled, and immediately realized what was happening. "Call the cops!" the shopkeeper shouted, and a few others nearby sprang into action. The kidnapper, realizing his pursuit had been foiled, hesitated. The bystanders started shouting and blocking his path. In a panic, the kidnapper turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing into the night. Elijah breathed a sigh of relief as Sophie collapsed into his arms, exhausted and scared, but safe. The shopkeeper stepped forward, offering them both some water and making sure they were okay. The police arrived shortly after, taking their statements and securing the scene. For the first time that night, Elijah let himself relax. He had saved Sophie, and the kidnapper was gone. But as the police took care of the situation, Elijah stayed by Sophie's side, making sure she was okay. He hadn't just saved a life, he'd changed one. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened next, he had done the right thing. As the police took care of the scene and made their way to interview the witnesses, the Millers, Sophie's parents, arrived, their faces a mixture of relief and panic. Sophie, her eyes still wide from the shock, broke free from the group of officers and ran toward them. "Mom! Dad!" Sophie cried out, tears still running down her cheeks. Her parents rushed to her, enveloping her in their arms, their worried faces relaxing into tears of joy. "Sophie, thank God you're safe," her mother said, her voice trembling. "We were so scared." Sophie, still in her father's arms, looked up at him and, with an innocent smile, pointed to Elijah. "This is Elijah. He saved me." The Millers looked down at the boy standing quietly by the officers. His ragged clothes and nervous stance contrasted sharply with their well-dressed, affluent appearance. Yet, in that moment, they saw something much more powerful: bravery and kindness in its purest form. Sophie's father, Mr. Miller, stepped forward and extended his hand to Elijah. "Thank you, son," he said with a lump in his throat. "You saved our daughter's life. We can never repay you for that." Elijah, somewhat taken aback by the attention, hesitated for a moment before taking Mr. Miller's hand. "I just did what anyone would do," Elijah said modestly, looking at his feet. He wasn't used to praise, especially not from people like the Millers. Mrs. Miller wiped her tears and knelt down to Elijah's level. "You're so brave," she said softly. "You're an angel. I don't know what we would have done without you." Elijah shuffled his feet uncomfortably, but felt a warmth spread through him at the kind words. He glanced over at Sophie, who smiled at him with gratitude. She leaned toward her parents and whispered something to them, pointing back at Elijah. Elijah had already done something he never thought possible. He had saved someone's life, and in doing so, his own life had already started to change. But it wasn't just the life of the little girl that would change, it was his own, too. As the police wrapped up their questions and the paramedics finished checking on Sophie, a group of news reporters arrived, cameras flashing as they approached the Millers. "Can you tell us how you found your daughter?" one of the reporters asked. "We were looking everywhere, calling the police, frantic," Mr. Miller said, visibly shaken but grateful. "And then we got the news that she was safe, thanks to Elijah. He's our hero." Elijah stood off to the side, not quite sure how to handle the attention, as cameras turned his way. The reporters crowded around him, bombarding him with questions, some even asking him about his life. He answered as best he could, but there was one thing that stuck out in his mind: his mother. He needed to find her. She would be worried sick. Despite his discomfort, Elijah found himself the center of attention as the story spread throughout the local news. Within hours, his brave act went viral. News outlets and social media were flooded with praise for the courageous young boy who had risked his life to save a stranger. Elijah, who had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, suddenly found himself hailed as a hero. People from all over the city sent messages of gratitude and admiration. Local schools, social organizations, and even a few local businesses offered their support. Elijah's name spread like wildfire through the community, and with it came a wave of goodwill. The Millers, deeply touched by Elijah's act of kindness, vowed to help him and his family. They reached out to Elijah's mother, and their story began to unfold in the news, showing the deep contrast between their privileged lives and Elijah's struggle. It wasn't long before community leaders began rallying around Elijah's cause, offering him scholarships and resources to help him rise above the difficulties of his current life. But for now, Elijah was simply grateful to have done something meaningful, something that had made a real difference in the world. As he watched Sophie run into her parents' arms again, his heart swelled with pride. He hadn't just saved her life, he had changed his own. The following evening, Elijah and his mother were invited to the Miller family's mansion for dinner. It was a massive change for them, stepping out of their modest world into a life of luxury they had never imagined. Elijah couldn't help but feel overwhelmed as they were escorted into the grand dining room. The chandelier above sparkled like a starry night, and the table was set with fine china. Everything around them screamed wealth, yet it wasn't just the lavish surroundings that made Elijah nervous. It was the people. Sophie, with her bright smile, introduced her parents to Elijah and his mother as they sat down to eat. The Millers made an effort to put them at ease, asking about their lives and treating them as equals rather than as people they were doing a favor for. It was a dinner filled with warmth, laughter, and conversations that touched on everything from food to family. But there was an underlying sense of something bigger that was about to happen. After the meal, Mr. Miller stood and looked at Elijah's mother with a kind expression. "We've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "What Elijah did for Sophie, what he did for our family, is something we'll never forget. And we don't believe he should stop here. We believe he deserves the chance to pursue his dreams, to build a future." Elijah and his mother exchanged nervous glances. They didn't quite understand what he meant. "We've decided to make sure he has those opportunities," Mr. Miller continued. "Elijah, we want to pay for your education at a prestigious private school. You'll have the best teachers, resources, and the chance to follow your passions." Tears welled in Elijah's eyes, but his heart was conflicted. He had never imagined anything like this. It felt like a dream he didn't know how to reach for. "Wait," Mrs. Miller added, as she sat down beside Elijah and his mother. "That's not all. Elijah, your mom deserves the same. We want to offer her a stable, high-paying job at our company. We'll make sure she's taken care of, so you both can have the future you deserve." Elijah's heart raced. This was more than they had ever hoped for, but it also felt too good to be true. He couldn't help but feel out of place. This wasn't his world. He had spent his life fighting for scraps, surviving on his own. How could they possibly fit into this world of privilege? "I don't know if we belong in your world," Elijah's mother said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm grateful, but we've never lived like this before. We don't know how." Mr. Miller smiled kindly, his eyes full of understanding. "I get it," he said. "It's a big change, and it's okay to be unsure. But I want you to understand that Sophie and I came from nothing. We worked hard, just like you. We know what it's like to struggle, to fight for a better life. And we want to offer that same chance to you, to your family. It's not about fitting in. It's about giving you both the opportunity to make the life you've always dreamed of." Sophie's mother took Elijah's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "We're not doing this out of charity. We're doing it because you deserve it. Elijah, you saved my daughter, and that is the kind of person we want to help. You'll have everything you need to succeed because you've already proven that you are capable of great things." Elijah looked at his mother, his heart swelling with pride, but also confusion. He was grateful, but how could he accept something so life-changing? Tears welled in his mother's eyes. "For you, Elijah, I'll do anything. You deserve this. I can't hold us back from the future you can have." She squeezed his hand, and in that moment, he knew she was right. This wasn't just about them. It was about his future. With a deep breath, Elijah nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, I'll do it. For us. For you, Mom." The Millers smiled, relieved and happy. They had made a life-changing decision, and now it was up to Elijah to embrace it. As the night continued, they shared more laughs and stories, and for the first time in his life, Elijah allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved the life they were offering. That night, as Elijah and his mother headed back to their new home, they felt a glimmer of hope for the future. A future that had seemed impossible just days before, but now felt within reach. With the support of the Millers, they had been given the gift of change, a chance to create a new life, not just for Elijah, but for their entire family. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah allowed himself to dream. Elijah's journey takes a turn for the better as he begins his new life. At his new school, he not only excels academically, but also becomes a beacon of hope for other students. His resilience and determination inspire his classmates, who look up to him as a leader. Though he faced challenges, Elijah never let his circumstances define him. Instead, he used his experiences to fuel his ambition, earning the respect of both his peers and teachers. His mother, too, flourishes in her new role at the company. With a stable job and a steady income, she is able to provide the family with the security they've always needed. Their new home is warm and full of promise, a far cry from the hardships they once faced in their cramped apartment. The weight of their struggles slowly begins to lift as they settle into a life filled with opportunity. As time passes, Elijah's bond with Sophie strengthens. What started as a courageous act of kindness has blossomed into a deep friendship. They spend time together, growing closer with each passing day. Their connection is a testament to the power of compassion and how small acts of bravery can change lives in ways they never imagined. The final scene takes place at Elijah's new school, where he's invited to speak at an assembly. Standing in front of a room full of students, he recounts his story, the struggles he faced, and the lessons he learned along the way. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, he says, his voice steady with conviction. It means you care enough to do what's right, even when it's hard. The room erupts in applause, the crowd moved by Elijah's words. Sophie, sitting in the audience, beams with pride as she watches her friend speak. For Elijah, it's not just the applause that matters. It's the realization that his actions have made a lasting impact, not only on his life, but on the lives of others as well. As the applause dies down, Elijah looks out at his classmates, grateful for the journey that has led him here. He no longer sees himself as just the boy from the rough neighborhood. He's a young man with a future full of promise, and he knows that his story is just beginning. The story closes with Sophie standing up, clapping for her best friend, knowing that together they've overcome so much. The power of kindness and courage has shaped their futures, and the world feels a little brighter because of it.